The afternoon sun cut a lazy rectangle of light across the faded rug in the piano room, turning floating dust into tiny swirling stars. In the middle of the room sat the boy Leo on the worn black bench before the old, scarred upright piano. His fingers, long and capable, rested on the keys, but his mind was a million miles away. He was thinking about the goal he'd almost scored in lunchtime football, the unbearable weight of his maths homework, and the weird metallic taste of the school canteen's gravy. The piano, with its silent, waiting teeth of ivory and ebony, was just another piece of furniture, another item on his Tuesday checklist. Between school and dinner, his teacher, Mr. Finch, watched him from his usual chair in the corner. To Leo, Mr. Finch was a bit like the piano itself, old, polished in places, scuffed in others, and full of a quiet, slightly intimidating presence. He was in his 60s, with hair the color of old silver and a face that seemed to have settled into a default expression of thoughtful observation. His eyebrows were particularly expressive. One often seemed to be slightly raised, as if perpetually questioning the world's choices, especially Leo's. Today's piece was Beethoven's Für Elise. Everyone knew the famous looping first few notes. It sounded simple. It was not. To Leo, the sheet music propped in front of him was not a beautiful message from a musical genius. It was a complicated traffic report written in a foreign language. It was a maze of little black dots, strange Italian. Words like cantabile and ritardando, and lines that swooped and swirled like motorway junctions. "Begin whenever you're ready, Leo," Mr. Finch said, his voice a soft, dry rustle of paper. It wasn't unkind, but it held no room for daydreaming. Leo nodded, pulled his thoughts back from the football pitch, and launched in. His head began its familiar, frantic dance. A quick glance down at the music, see a cluster of notes. A snap of the head to the keys, find them, press them. Back to the music? Oh, a sharp, remember that. Back to the keys, stretched the little finger. It was a physical, jerky process. His body was tense, his shoulders up near his ears. The notes came out in the right order, mostly. You could hum along to it. It was, technically, Für Elise. But it was Für Elise, as recited by someone reading a phone book. The famous, sighing melody had no sigh. The gentle, rolling feel of it was stiff and mechanical. The quiet parts were just quiet, not tender. The slightly faster, more dramatic middle section was just a burst of louder, anxious fumbling. The music was all in his eyes, shooting down the nerves to his fingers. None of it passed through his heart, or even his ears, really. He was decoding, not playing. Mr. Finch listened, his fingers steepled under his chin. He didn't see a lazy or untalented boy. He saw a prisoner. The prison bars were the 5 lines of the stave. Leo was so busy following the map that he never once looked up to see the landscape the map was trying to show him. The music was trapped on the paper. The beautiful singing tone of the piano, the emotional story Beethoven had tucked into those notes, was completely missing. It was like watching someone beautifully pronounce words in a language they didn't understand. The piece stumbled to its end. Leo hit the final note, and his shoulders dropped, a silent thank goodness escaping him as a breath. He looked at Mr. Finch, hoping for a good enough "see you next week." Mr. Finch was silent for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked. A car went by outside. Finally, he shifted in his chair. "Tell me," he said, "what is the story of that piece?" Leo blinked. "Story? It doesn't have a story. It's just music. Is it?" Mr. Finch asked, that one eyebrow inching higher. "All music is a conversation, a feeling, those first 3 notes. They're not just notes. They're a call, a whisper. Someone saying, 'Listen.' What happens after that whisper?" Leo looked back at the sheet music, confused. It was just E, D sharp, E again. Data. I don't know, he muttered. You play the notes correctly. Mr. Finch continued, standing up and moving slowly towards the piano. But you play them as if you are afraid of them, as if they belong to the paper, not to you. You are borrowing them very carefully, and you will give them back when you are done. The music does not live inside you. It lives out here. He tapped the sheet music with a thin finger. It made a dry, empty sound. Leo felt a flicker of irritation. He was playing the notes. What more did the old man want? He'd practiced, hadn't he? He'd done the boring finger exercises. He'd slowly worked through each bar. Wasn't that the point? Mr. Finch seemed to read his thoughts. The point, he said softly, as if to himself, is not to get from the beginning to the end without crashing. The point is to take someone on a journey, to make them feel that whisper. He looked at Leo, and for the first time, Leo saw something other than quiet observation in his teacher's eyes. It looked like a decision being made. You have good hands, Leo. You have a good ear. But you are using neither. You are using only your eyes. And music is not for the eyes. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the lesson. He made Leo play scales, focusing on making the sound smooth like melted chocolate instead of choppy like typewriter keys. He had him play simple chords and just hold them, listening to the way the sound vibrated and faded in the air. It was weird, and Leo didn't really get it. He just wanted to be done. When the lesson time was finally up, Leo packed his bag quickly, eager for the freedom outside the door. Mr. Finch saw him out with a quiet, "Practice the Beethoven." Not just the notes, the spaces between the notes. Leo nodded, already halfway out the door. As he cycled home, the cool air on his face, he pushed the strange lesson from his mind. He'd practice all right. He'd go over the tricky bits, the bits where his head-bobbing dance always got out of sync. He'd get the map memorized even better. Back in the quiet piano room, Mr. Finch stood by the window, watching the boy disappear down the street. He looked at the piano, then at the stand where the sheet music for Fur Elise still sat. The late afternoon sun had moved, leaving the room in soft shadow. He knew exactly what was happening. Leo would go home and practice the same way, with more determination, getting slightly better at the mechanical process, digging himself deeper into the prison of the page. A teacher's job, Mr. Finch believed, wasn't just to instruct. Sometimes it was to disrupt, to create a moment where the old, failing way of doing things became impossible, so a new way could struggle to be born. It was a risky thing to do. It could backfire. The student could get angry, give up, but watching Leo play with such skill and so little soul had settled it for him. The boy needed to forget how to read, just for a moment, in order to learn how to listen. He needed to be lost to find his way. Mr. Finch walked to the music stand. He carefully lifted the pages of Fur Elise. He didn't fold them or put them in a drawer. He carried them across the room and placed them, standing upright, on the top shelf of his bookcase, between a thick history of composers and a volume of poetry. They were in plain sight, but they were out of reach. He had made his decision. Next week, he would remove the map, and they would see if the boy could discover the territory that lay hidden, not on the paper, but in his own mind, in his own hands. And in the silence, after the last wrong note faded away, the following Tuesday arrived with a steady gray drizzle that matched Leo's mood. He'd practiced. He really had. He'd sat at the piano at home, putting in the time, focusing especially on the middle section of Fur Elise that always tripped him up. He'd gotten better at the head-bobbing dance. His eyes snapped from page to keys a little faster. The notes were more accurate. He walked into Mr. Finch's piano room, feeling a faint, smug sense of readiness. He'd solved the puzzle. He was prepared. The room was the same, the dusty sunlight replaced by the softer, cooler light of a rainy afternoon, the same quiet, the same smell of old paper and polished wood. Mr. Finch sat in his corner chair, looking like he hadn't moved since last week. He gave Leo a small nod as the boy took his place on the bench, shuffling his backpack to the floor. "Let's hear the Beethoven," Mr. Finch said. Skipping any preamble, Leo adjusted the stool, took a breath, and arranged the sheet music neatly on the stand. He found the starting position, his fingers hovering over the familiar keys. He began dot. It was better. He could feel it. The notes flowed with fewer stumbles. The tricky run in the middle section, while not perfect, didn't completely fall apart. He finished with a solid, confident press of the final note. He turned to Mr. Finch, expecting to see that slight nod of approval, maybe even a quiet better. Mr. Finch's face showed nothing. No approval, no disapproval. It was as still as the surface of a pond. The silence stretched out, filled only by the soft patter of rain against the window. Leo's confidence began to deflate, replaced by a creeping confusion. Finally, Mr. Finch spoke. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's silence sharply. "You practiced the map," he said. I practiced the piece," Leo corrected, a defensive edge in his voice. "You practiced the instructions," Mr. Finch said, standing up slowly. He walked towards the piano, not with anger, but with a deliberate, calm purpose. "You followed the lines more accurately. But the music is still out here." He tapped the paper again, just like last week. "It is not in here." He pointed a finger, not at Leo's head, but vaguely at his chest. Leo felt a hot flush of frustration. What did the man want? He'd done the work. He'd improved. It felt deeply, profoundly unfair. Then Mr. Finch did something that made Leo's stomach drop. He leaned forward, his hands moving towards the music stand. With a smooth, effortless motion, he lifted the pages of sheet music right off the stand. He didn't crumple them. He didn't throw them. He simply gathered them into a neat stack, the pages making a soft, shuffling sound that was terribly loud in the quiet room. Leo's hands, still resting on the keys, went cold. "Mr. Finch?" he said, his voice tighter than he meant it to be. I don't have it memorized." "I know," Mr. Finch said, his tone utterly matter-of-fact, as if he'd just commented on the rain. He turned and walked away from the piano, across the small room, to his tall, crowded bookcase. He slid the sheets of music onto the top shelf, right where he'd placed them the week before. They stood there, white and accusing, next to the old books. He turned back to face Leo, who was now staring at him, a mix of panic and betrayal on his face. The safe ground had been pulled away. His crutches had been kicked out from under him. "Now," Mr. Finch said, walking back and resuming his seat. He settled into it, folding his hands in his lap. "Now the piece is in your hands and in your ears. It is not in your eyes. Begin again." The words hung in the air. Begin again. It was an impossible request. It was like being told to build a house after someone had taken away all the tools and the blueprint. Leo looked at the empty music stand. It was a stark, black skeleton. He looked at the black and white keys, which suddenly seemed like a vast, confusing desert. He looked at his own hands, which felt like clumsy foreign objects. "I can't," Leo whispered, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You have just played it," Mr. Finch replied calmly. "The memory is in your fingers. You just have to listen for it. Start with the first note. Just the first note." Swallowing hard, Leo turned back to the piano. The silence in the room pressed in on him. He tried to picture the sheet music in his mind. He could sort of see the first measure, a blurry image. He tentatively pressed a key. It was wrong. A sour flat note rang out. He flinched. He tried another. Wrong again. A third try. Closer, but still not the right starting note. His face was burning now. This was humiliation. This was pointless. He clenched his fists in his lap, fighting the urge to just get up and walk out. "Listen," Mr. Finch said, his voice cutting through Leo's spiraling thoughts. There was no impatience in it. "Not with your mind's eye. With your mind's ear. Hum it." Feeling utterly foolish, Leo, still facing the keys, gave a weak, almost silent hum of the first three notes of Fur Elise. The sound was barely there. "Louder," Mr. Finch said. Leo hummed again, a little stronger. The melody, that simple, famous little sigh, was there in his voice. "Good," Mr. Finch said. "Now, find that pitch on the piano. Don't look for a spot on a page. Listen for the match." Leo hummed the note again, and this time, while humming, he let a finger drift over the keys, pressing one lightly. It was wrong. He adjusted, found another. The sound of the key and the sound of his hum merged. It was the note. He had found it without looking. A tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of something happened in his chest. It wasn't triumph. It was just a small spark of connection. "Now the next one," Mr. Finch guided. Slowly, painfully, note by note, Leo reconstructed the first phrase. It took minutes. There were wrong turns, moments of blank panic where the next note was just gone from his memory. But Mr. Finch didn't intervene. He just waited. He didn't offer the next note. He just let the silence sit there until Leo, by humming, by trial and error, by sheer desperate feeling, found it. The sound of the piano was completely different now. It wasn't a flow of notes. It was a series of isolated discoveries. Each correct note felt like a small victory, a tiny light blinking on in a dark room. He wasn't playing music. He was finding music. He was an archaeologist brushing sand away from buried bones, slowly revealing a shape. He got through the first famous phrase. Then he stopped. The next part was a blank. A wall. He shook his head. "I don't remember what comes next," he said, his voice thick with frustration. Mr. Finch stood up again. This time, he came and sat on the bench beside Leo, a rare thing. He didn't speak. He simply reached out his own hands, with their thin, age-spotted fingers, and placed them on the keys. And he played. He played the same first phrase Leo had just struggled through. But it wasn't the same. In Mr. Finch's hands, the notes were not separate discoveries. They were a single breathing thought. They were gentle, they yearned, they whispered and faded. He didn't play it from frantic memory. He played it from a deep, quiet place of knowing. It sounded like a real person, sighing. It was beautiful in a way that made Leo's own attempt feel like a child's toy. Then, Mr. Finch continued, moving seamlessly into the next part, the part Leo had forgotten. He played it slowly, clearly, letting each chord ring. He wasn't showing off. He was translating. He was showing Leo the sound of the memory he was looking for. "That," Mr. Finch said softly as the last note faded, his hand still resting on the keys, "is the sound you're looking for. The map is gone. Now you must follow the sound. Find it." He got up and returned to his chair, leaving Leo alone again with the silent, expectant piano. The rest of the lesson was the hardest, most exhausting 30 minutes of Leo's life. It was not piano practice. It was a mental and physical excavation. He would fumble, hum, hit a wrong cluster of notes, groan in frustration, stop, and then slowly, painstakingly, try again. Sometimes a whole bar would suddenly come back to him in a rush, his fingers moving almost on their own. More often, it was a grueling, note-by-note reconstruction. But a strange thing began to happen. Without the paper to stare at, Leo started to really hear the relationships between the notes. He felt the small leap from one chord to the next in his hands, a physical distance to remember. He started to sense the shape of the piece, not as lines on a page, but as a landscape of hills and valleys, of tension and release. When the lesson time finally ended, Leo was mentally drained. His head ached. He felt bruised. Mr. Finch simply said, "Next week, we will continue." Leo packed his bag in silence, not looking at his teacher. He felt raw and resentful. He walked out into the drizzle, the cold rain feeling like a relief on his hot face. The teacher had taken away the only thing that made him feel safe, competent. It felt like a cruel trick. He cycled home through the wet streets, the rhythm of the wheels matching anew. Relentless refrain in his head, the opening notes of For Elise playing over and over, not as notes on a page, but as a pure, haunting sound. He couldn't get it out of his head. And for the first time, he realized he didn't need the paper to hear it. The sound, at least that first whisper of it, was now living rent-free inside him, and he had no idea what to do with it. Leo didn't touch the piano for 2 days. The black, silent instrument in the corner of his living room seemed to watch him, like a sleeping animal he'd accidentally kicked. He was mad. It was a slow, simmering kind of anger, mixed with a big dose of embarrassment. He felt tricked. He'd done what he was supposed to do. He'd improved, and for what? To be humiliated. To have the rug pulled out from under him in the most literal way. Mr. Finch, with his quiet voice and his impossible demands, felt less like a teacher and more like an obstacle. He busied himself with other things. He threw himself into his homework. He played video games with a fierce concentration. He talked a bit more at dinner, telling his parents about things at school, anything to fill the space where the thought of the piano usually lived. His mom asked, "How was your lesson?" And he just shrugged and said, "Fine," in a tone that ended the conversation. But the piece followed him. It was like a ghost in his head. In the quiet moments, walking between classes, lying in bed before sleep, even in the middle of a TV show, the first phrase of For Elise would start up. Not the stiff, mechanical version he played. The version Mr. Finch had played. That soft, sighing, living sound. It would loop in his mind, clear as a bell, and then it would get to the edge of what he knew, and stop. It was a door opening just a crack, showing a glimpse of a room, then slamming shut. It was frustrating in a whole new way. The music was there, inside his own skull, but he couldn't reach out and grab it. On the third evening, after finishing his homework, he found himself just sitting on the living room sofa, staring at the piano. The house was quiet. His parents were reading in the other room. The anger had burned down a little, leaving behind something else, a nagging, itchy curiosity, and a challenge. Could he do it? Not for Mr. Finch, but just to see? To prove to himself that he wasn't completely helpless without those pieces of paper? He didn't make a big decision. He just stood up, walked over, and sat on the bench. He lifted the fallboard, revealing the keys. He didn't open his book bag to get the sheet music. He left it on the floor. He just sat there, looking at the black and white patterns, listening to the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. He took a breath, closed his eyes, and tried to hear that first note. Not see it on a line, but hear its particular plaintive sound. He hummed it quietly, found it with a single finger. There. He played the next two notes, the simple falling pattern. It was shaky, but it was the right sound. Then he opened his eyes. He stared at his hands on the keys, as if they belonged to someone else. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "What's next?" It was like trying to remember a dream. The general feeling was there, but the details were fog. He tried to force his memory to show him the page. He could almost see the blur of it, but it was useless. So he tried a different way. He played the first 3 notes again, and then he let his fingers hover, waiting. He tried a note. It was wrong. It sounded ugly and out of place. He winced and tried another. Also wrong. He stopped. He was doing it the hard way again, just guessing. He remembered what Mr. Finch had said. Listen. So he started humming. He hummed the first phrase, then kept humming, making up sounds, trying to feel the melody in his throat. He sort of mumbled-sang a possible next bit. It sounded vaguely familiar. He tried to match those mumbled notes on the piano. A note here, a chord there. It was a mess, but in the mess, a couple of notes fit. They sounded right. They felt like they belonged to the family of the first 3 notes. A little spark went off. He wasn't reading. He wasn't even really remembering. He was exploring. It was slow. It was full of mistakes. But for the first time, he wasn't trying to be perfect. He was just trying to find the path. He broke the piece into tiny, tiny pieces. Not even whole bars. Just little musical thoughts, 2 or 3 notes at a time. He would work on one little cluster until his fingers remembered the shape of it. He'd play it over and over, not to get it fast, but to get the feel of it, the distance his hand had to stretch, the gentle pressure of one finger compared to another. He discovered that the muscle memory in his hands was stronger than the visual memory in his head. His fingers, which had danced that jerky dance for weeks, knew things his brain had forgotten. If he let them relax and just feel for the next note, sometimes they would find it, like a blind person finding a familiar object on a table. The wrong notes stopped feeling like failures. They became information. A wrong note told him, not that one. Try the neighbor. A wrong chord told him his hand was in the wrong position. He started to learn the geography of the piece. He realized the left hand often did a simple rocking pattern. He realized the right hand melody often moved in steps, like walking up or down a small staircase. He wasn't memorizing a list of instructions. He was learning the layout of a town. He worked on it for maybe 20 minutes, maybe 40. He lost track of time. He only got through the first page of what the sheet music would have shown. It was riddled with pauses and mistakes. But he owned every single note. They weren't borrowed. They were his. He had dug each one out of the silence himself. When he finally stopped, his shoulders were tight, but his mind was weirdly clear. The frustration was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet tiredness. He hadn't conquered the piece. Far from it. But he had started a conversation with it. The next day, he went back to the piano. This time, there was less anger and more purpose. He sat down and went straight to the little clusters he'd worked on the night before. To his surprise, they were still there in his fingers. A little rusty, but the shapes were familiar. He spent that session trying to connect the clusters, to build a bridge from one to the next. It was like connecting dots, but the dots were feelings in his hands and sounds in his ears. He found a notebook and a pencil. He didn't write down notes. He couldn't. Instead, he made his own bizarre code. He drew a small star for the first cluster. He wrote LH rocks GE for the left-hand pattern he'd noticed. He drew an arrow pointing up with the word tense next to a bit that sounded dramatic. It was a map of feelings and actions, not a map of symbols. His own personal guide. By the end of the week, the ghost in his head had changed. It wasn't just the opening phrase anymore. It was longer. It had texture. He could hear the whole first section in his mind, complete with the fuzzy, unresolved patches where he still got lost. The piece was no longer in it out there. It was becoming a place inside him. A place he was slowly, patiently furnishing, one remembered sound, one familiar hand shape at a time. The night before his next lesson, he sat at the piano one last time. He played what he knew. It wasn't fluid. It wasn't performance ready. It stopped and started, but it was connected. He could feel the story of it, the whisper turning into a conversation, the conversation building to a little outburst of feeling, then settling back down. He didn't play it right, but for the first time, he felt he was playing something that was true. He closed the piano lid and went to bed. He wasn't confident. He was nervous. Mr. Finch would surely hear all the pauses, all the imperfections. But the burning resentment was gone. In its place was a faint, stubborn sense of something else. He had done the work, his way, and even if it wasn't perfect, he had found a path through the silence. He had something, however small, to bring into the room. He wasn't sure what the teacher would say, but for the first time, Leo felt like he might actually have something to say back. The day of the next lesson felt different. The sky was a clear, pale blue, and the air had a crisp edge to it. Leo cycled to Mr. Finch's house, not with the old dread or the simmering anger, but with a quiet, churning focus. His mind wasn't a blank. It was full of sound and sensation, the feel of the chords under his fingers, the little leaps his hand had learned to make, the specific spots where he always hesitated. His notebook, with its weird personal code, was in his bag, but he knew he wouldn't need it. The map was inside him now, strange and patchy as it was. He walked into the piano room. Everything was the same, the scent, the light, the quiet. Mr. Finch sat in his chair, a book closed on his lap. He looked at Leo and gave the same small, unreadable nod. Leo didn't wait for instruction. He put his bag down, walked to the piano bench, and sat. He adjusted the stool just so. His hands felt calm. He glanced over at the bookcase. The white sheets of fur Elise were still there, standing upright like a monument to a past life. He looked at them for a second, then looked away. He didn't need to go over there. He didn't want to. He placed his hands on his knees, took a slow, deep breath, and closed his eyes. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. He just needed to shut out the room, to go into the landscape he'd been building all week. "Whenever you're ready," Mr. Finch's voice came, softer than usual. Leo nodded, though his eyes were still closed. He didn't start by finding the first note on the piano. He started by hearing it in his head. That clear, plaintive call. He let the sound fill his mind's ear. Then, with his eyes still shut, he let his right hand drift over the keys. His fingers found the spot, not by looking, but by a kind of internal radar. He pressed the key. The note rang out, pure and simple. It wasn't just a note. It was an intention. He opened his eyes then, but he didn't look at his hands. He looked at the music stand, still empty. He played the next two notes, the sigh that followed the call. They were connected, a single thought. There was no jerky head movement. His body was still. All the motion was in his hands and forearms, fluid and purposeful. He moved into the next phrase. This was where he'd stumbled in his practice, a transition that always felt clumsy. His fingers approached it, and for a heartbeat they faltered. The old panic, the fear of the blank, tried to rise up. But instead of seizing, he did what he'd learned to do at home. He slowed down. He didn't stop. He let his left hand carry the gentle rocking rhythm, and his right hand felt for the next note, found it, and settled into the new pattern. It wasn't perfect. There was a tiny gap, a moment of air. But it wasn't a crash. It was a breath, he continued. He wasn't playing for Mr. Finch. He wasn't even playing the piece. He was walking through the remembered rooms of it. Here was the corridor of the main theme, familiar and winding. Here was the little step up into the slightly brighter, more questioning middle section. His muscles remembered the stretch. His ears were wide open, listening ahead, guiding his hands. The wrong notes he hit weren't disasters. They were slight missteps, immediately corrected because he knew the sound he was aiming for. He could hear the destination. He reached the dramatic part, the section that had once been just a frantic scramble of louder notes. Now he felt its character. It wasn't about being loud. It was about being full. He leaned into the keys, letting the chords resonate, feeling the passion Beethoven had tucked in there. It was short, just a few bars, but he played it with a feeling that surprised even him. Then came the tumble of notes leading back down, like a sigh after strong emotion, and he navigated it carefully. Not with speed, but with clarity. Each note a stepping stone dot, and then he was back to the beginning theme. But it was different now. It wasn't a simple return. It felt wiser, a little sadder, like someone coming home after feeling a big feeling. He played the final, falling notes. They were quiet, deliberate. They didn't end with a bang, but with a gentle release, a letting go. The last note faded into the room's silence. Leo kept his hands on the keys for a second, feeling the faint vibration die away. Then he slowly lowered them to his lap. He felt empty, but in a good way, like he'd told a long, important story and was now quiet. He finally looked at Mr. Finch. His teacher hadn't moved. He was still sitting in his chair, his hands folded, but his posture was different. He wasn't leaning back in observation. He was perfectly still, as if he'd been holding his breath. The usual critical, analytical look on his face was gone. In its place was something simpler. Something like recognition. The silence stretched. It wasn't the harsh, judging silence of the first lesson without the music. This was a full silence, a silence that held the echo of what had just been played. Mr. Finch's eyes were bright. Very slowly he nodded. Not the small, administrative nod from before. This was a deep, deliberate gesture of understanding. He didn't say, "Well done." He didn't say, "That was perfect," because it hadn't been. There had been pauses, a slight rhythmic stumble in one place, a note that was a little too heavy in another. What he said was far more important. "Good," Mr. Finch said, the single word carrying a world of meaning. It was an acknowledgement of the journey, not just the destination. Then he continued, his dry voice now warm with a subtle, unmistakable energy. "Now you have something to say." Leo felt those words sink in. They weren't about being correct. They were about having a voice. For weeks he'd been a messenger, badly reading someone else's mail. Today he had spoken. He had used Beethoven's words, but he had said them with his own voice. Mr. Finch stood up. He didn't go to the bookcase. He didn't retrieve the sheet music. He walked to the piano and looked down at the keys as if seeing them anew. "You found the music in the silence," he said, more to himself than to Leo. "That is where it always is. The paper is just a reminder for those who have forgotten." He looked at Leo. "The notes you missed will come. Now that you are listening, they will find you. Speed will come. But the important thing, you have it." He walked back to his chair and sat, picking up his book but not opening it. "Next week," he said, a new, almost brisk tone in his voice, "we begin Batch, a little piece called Minuet in G. It has a different conversation. A dance. You will learn it the same way. I will give you the map for 1 week. Then we put it away. You will find the dance in your feet, or rather in your fingers." Leo just nodded, a flood of relief and a strange new excitement washing through him. Batch, another map to eventually put away, another landscape to learn. It didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded like an adventure. "Okay," Leo said, his own voice sounding clearer than he expected. He packed his bag slowly. As he zipped it up, he glanced once more at the sheet music on the shelf. It looked different now. Not like a lifeline he'd been denied, but like a old, Faded photograph of a place he now knew intimately. The streets, the smells, the light. He knew he could look at it again now, and it would make a different kind of sense. It would be a record of a journey taken, not a set of instructions for one he was afraid to start. He said a quiet "see you next week" to Mr. Finch, who gave one final, approving nod. Leo stepped out into the clear afternoon. The sun felt warm on his face. As he unlocked his bike, the melody of the Beethoven piece ran through his mind, clean and whole. But it wasn't the only thing in there. Beneath it, like a whisper of a future rhythm, was a curious, tapping, orderly pulse. It might have been his heartbeat. Or it might have been the first distant hint of a minuet, waiting for him to learn its steps. For the first time, he was eager to find out. The weeks that followed were different. They weren't easier, but the struggle had changed its shape. It was no longer a fight against a confusing map. It was an exploration of new territory. Bach's Minuet in G was, as Mr. Finch had said, a conversation. A polite, structured, and incredibly precise dance between the right hand and the left. Leo would get the sheet music, study it for a week, learn the basic steps, and then, just as promised, Mr. Finch would take it away. That first time with the Bach was almost as hard as the Beethoven. The fear of the empty music stand returned in a cold rush. But this time, Leo knew the fear for what it was. Just a signal that he was about to learn something real. He knew how to begin. He would hum. He would feel for the shapes in his hands. He would listen for the logic in the phrases. He learned to trust the process of getting lost. The minuet slowly moved from his eyes to his fingers, from the paper to his memory. It became a series of elegant, interlocking patterns. He started to hear the left hand, not just as accompaniment, but as a partner in the dance, having its own thoughtful, melodic line. Playing from memory became less of a terrifying test and more of a natural way things were done. The sheet music was a starting point, a brief introduction. The real relationship with the piece happened when the paper was gone. One afternoon, about 2 months after the day with the Beethoven, something happened. Leo was practicing the minuet at home. He was playing it smoothly, his mind relaxed, his attention on the balanced, graceful sound. He reached a part where the music shifted, moving to a slightly darker, more thoughtful chord for a few bars before returning to the main theme. He played through this section, and as his fingers left those somber notes and began the journey back to the bright, familiar beginning, a fragment of For Elise floated, unbidden, into his mind. Not the whole piece, just a feeling, a particular emotional color from its more dramatic middle section. Without even thinking about it, as his hands carried on with the Bach, that feeling seeped into his touch. The return of the minuet's main theme came out not just bright, but with a hint of relief, as if it had passed through a small shadow and was glad to be back in the sun. He stopped playing, his hands hovering over the keys. He replayed the last few bars. He hadn't changed a single note, but he had changed the way he played them. He had added a story, a tiny sliver of feeling that came from a different piece entirely. It was his feeling. He had mixed two things he knew and made a third new thing. For a second, he felt like a magician. He had just discovered that music wasn't just about recreating what was written. It could be about what you brought to it. He didn't tell Mr. Finch about this little discovery. It felt too private, too fragile. But it changed how he approached everything. He started listening to recordings of the pieces he was learning, not to copy them, but to hear the different stories other pianists found in the same notes. One pianist's minuet was stately and royal. Another's was light and playful. Which one felt right to him? He began to make those choices. His lessons with Mr. Finch became quieter, deeper discussions. There were fewer instructions about fingers and more about philosophy. Why do you think it slows down here? Mr. Finch would ask. It feels like a question has been asked. And now we're waiting for the answer, Leo would venture. Good. Play the question. Play the waiting. The teacher was no longer a gatekeeper, holding the key to the sheet music. He was a guide, pointing out interesting features in a landscape Leo was learning to navigate on his own. One gray Tuesday, Leo arrived for his lesson to find Mr. Finch not in his chair, but standing by the window, looking out at the rain. Today, Mr. Finch said, turning around, we will do something else. Play the Beethoven. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Leo hadn't practiced for release in weeks. He'd been deep in the world of Bach. He felt a flicker of the old anxiety. What if he'd forgotten? What if the map he'd worked so hard to internalize had faded? He sat at the piano. The sheet music was, of course, still on the shelf. He didn't even consider asking for it. He closed his eyes, searching for the piece in the library of his mind. It was there, on a shelf, a little dusty. He took it down. He began. The first notes came, not from frantic memory, but from a deep, quiet well. They were more beautiful than he remembered them being. He wasn't fighting the piece anymore. He was inhabiting it. His hands moved with a confidence that had been earned through struggle. The pauses that had once been gaps of panic were now thoughtful breaths. The dramatic section swelled not with loud clumsiness, but with a genuine, controlled passion. He remembered the frustration, the anger at Mr. Finch, the long, quiet nights of piecing it together alone. All of that was in the music now. It had texture. It had a history dot when he finished. The room was still. He opened his eyes. Mr. Finch had a small, soft smile on his face, a sight as rare as sunlight in that room. You see, he said simply, it is yours now. It will always be yours. You can forget the notes for a year, for 10 years. You will be able to find them again, because you know the place they live. He walked over to the bookcase. He reached up and took down the sheets of fur Elise. He didn't hand them to Leo. He carried them to the piano and placed them carefully on the music stand. Look, he said. Leo looked at the page he had once stared at with such dependence. It was just paper. The symbols were familiar, but they had no power over him anymore. He could read them, but he didn't need to. The paper is a servant, Mr. Finch said, not a master. You spent so long being its slave. Now you can tell it what to do. Use it. Or don't. It is your choice. He left the music on the stand and returned to his chair. Now the batch. From memory, please. Leo didn't hesitate. He turned away from the Beethoven pages, faced the empty space to his left, and began the precise dancing steps of the minuet. His mind was clear. He was playing, not remembering after the lesson. As Leo was packing his bag, Mr. Finch spoke again. What you learned was not how to memorize, he said. Many people can memorize. You learned how to listen. You learned how to hear the music before you play it. That is the only skill that matters. Everything else is just fingers. Leo cycled home through the rain, but he didn't feel wet or cold. He felt warm with a quiet understanding. The battle was over. He had won something far bigger than the ability to play one piece without paper. He had found a way in. A door had opened in a wall he didn't even know was there. That evening at home, he sat at his piano. He opened a book of simple sonatinas. He played one through, reading the notes. It was pleasant. Then he played the first line again and closed the book. He tried to play the next bit from what he could hear in his head. He made mistakes. He got lost. He smiled. It was just a new piece of territory, a new silence to explore. He wasn't afraid of the empty space anymore. He knew it was just full of music, waiting to be discovered. The lesson hadn't ended that afternoon. It had just become his way of being in the world. One note, one phrase, one piece of beautiful, patient silence at a time.